Hello, folks, and welcome to Ask Resource Center's Learning Over Lunch webinar series. Just some quick housekeeping before we get started. Just so you know, all of our webinars are recorded. So after the presentation, there will be email access to the recording and any related handouts, as well as a link to a short training survey. We encourage and appreciate any feedback that you have to help us improve our trainings. And also, our archived webinars are available on our website at askresource.org/webinars. And with that out of the way, today we are pleased to host attorney Nathan Kirstein from Disability Rights Iowa. Nathan previously worked as a contract attorney for the Public Defender's Office in Des Moines and is very involved in community activities, especially those relating to children and youth. And in today's webinar, State Complaints, How It's Filed Matters, Nathan will share helpful tips and strategies for filing a state complaint and will walk us through the model form to assist parents and guardians in filing a complaint. Nathan will also answer some questions, and they will be compiled into a question and answer handout that will be available after the presentation. Now we're going to turn it over to our presenter, Nathan, and thank you again for joining us today. You can take your show on the road, Nathan. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Ask Resources, for the opportunity to present today and talk to people about state complaints, what they are, and how to best file them. So I'm going to go over, first of all, what is a state complaint and some of the who, what, where, when. Then I'm going to talk about the process of once you've filed it, what happens. And then I'm going to talk about, okay, how do you best write one? And for that, I'm going to be walking through the model form that the Iowa Department of Education has provided on their website for folks to use when they're filing a complaint with the Department of Education. So first of all, what is a state complaint? Well, it's pretty simple. It is a written complaint to the Iowa Department of Education that is about some violation of Part B of the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Part B is the part that would have to do with individuals, eligible individuals ages 3 through 21. So that's a vast amount of stuff that you can complain about under this state complaint. And the Iowa Department of Education, then if they find that the complaint shows that there is something, that if the complaint, if taken to be true on its face, all the words that are on there, if they were to be true, and that would be a violation of the IDEA, then they'd go through and investigate and write an order for remedies, that's the legal term, for solutions to any of the problems that may have been found. Who can write a complaint? Anyone really can write a complaint, meaning you can write one on behalf of your child. You can write one on behalf of someone else's child if you have the permission of that legal guardian. An organization can write one on behalf of nobody or multiple individuals. When does this complaint have to be filed? It has to be filed within a year from when the problem that's going to be complained about, a year from when that problem occurred. So let's say if something happened in September 1st of 2017 and kind of happened within that week, let's say, and you want to write a complaint about that, then you have to have that complaint filed with the Iowa Department of Education by September 1st of 2018. State complaint process. So what's the process that you would be walking through if you file a complaint? Well, first of all, you got to write one, and I'd recommend using the model form, and I'll talk about how to do that here in a moment, like I said. It needs to be mailed to the director of the Iowa Department of Education. That's where you send the original. Then you have to mail a copy to the school district you're complaining about, to that district. And if you're complaining about the AEA, you got to mail a copy to that area education agency as well. Once the Iowa Department of Education receives the complaint, then they got to make a decision whether they'll investigate. Like I said before, they have 5 days to make this decision to let you know whether they're going to investigate or not. If they do decide to investigate, they have 60 days to write a decision. So they have 60 days to gather information from all parties, to do their own investigation. That might include visiting the school district or the school and pulling their own records. Once that 60 days is up, then they have to write a decision that says whether or not they found violations, what those violations were legally, and what the solutions are going to be for those violations, right? And that would be in their corrective action plan. The corrective action plan can include compensatory education, which is educational services that would close the gap in education and educational achievement caused by the violations. So that would be additional services for that student or students. Monetary reimbursement if that student was placed into a private school setting because of the violations and the parent and student followed the legal rules for that under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Or maybe let's say something like tutoring, private tutoring, because of the educational gap that's being created by the school not providing the appropriate services and violating the IDEA. That could be a monetary reimbursement as well if the parents spent money on private tutoring because of that. They can also require any other type of corrective actions that have to do with training, coaching, things like that for the school personnel to make sure that these violations do not occur anymore. Oftentimes, the school has multiple things they may have to do, the school district and school, after one of these types of orders, and they have up to a year to correct those issues. And so they have a year usually to follow up with the corrective action plan. That does not mean that they get to wait a year to do something. It means that the folks that wrote these regulations understood that, you know, if you're going to order training, if you're going to order compensatory education for several different youth within a district, that might take a while to figure out how all that works. And so they wanted to give the schools up to a year to be able to do that, just so it's done in the right way and it's not hurried up and done in some type of way that's loosey-goosey, but in a real and practical way. But that doesn't mean the school district gets to drag their feet either if they can do some of the corrective action right away. One thing that I did not mention within the state complaint process is once that's filed, and if the Department of Education decides to investigate this complaint, you as the writer and the school district as the other party and the AEA as another party are able to, if you want to, engage in what's called an AEA resolution facilitator process. And that is where the AEA provides a facilitator to work through the issues that are written in the complaint. Also, you are able to participate in the voluntary process of mediation, where a state mediator is provided, a neutral mediator, to work with the parties in order to come to some type of conclusion and solution regarding the issues within the complaint. Both of those are voluntary processes, both can be done partially. So let's say there's a few things that everybody could agree on, but there's a couple issues where parties just can't agree on and they need the state to be involved in writing an actual decision. That can be done. You can agree on a few of the issues, write a mediation agreement or a facilitation agreement as to those issues, and then have the Department of Education decide on the rest of the issues that may have not been able to be agreed upon. Also, if you don't find any type of agreement during that, that doesn't stop you from requesting that the DE, the Iowa Department of Education, continue in their investigation process because you tried mediation and it failed. Okay? So, one other thing I want to say about the process before I get into writing a state complaint is once the Department of Education has written a decision and has ordered some type of solutions or has just possibly decided against what you wanted and said, you know what, I don't find any violations here. Well, you have the right to appeal that decision made by the Iowa Department of Education to a state district court. That is where it would be important to consult an attorney and not try to do that on your own in order to decide whether or not that's something that you would win, whether it's worth your time and money to try to go for that. And if you are going to do that, how you would be represented in that, because you would need representation in a district court. I wouldn't advise you on the district court on your own. However, anything before that, in terms of writing a state complaint and things like that, you may do on your own, and there is no need for an attorney. And that's why I think this is an accessible dispute resolution process, because it doesn't require you to have an attorney like a due process would in terms of going in front of a administrative law judge. So, how do you write a complaint? Well, I think it's important to use the Iowa Department of Education's model form to assist parents or guardians in filing a complaint. That is found on their website. You can type it in on the Iowa Department of Education search bar in their website. You can type in state complaint and you can find the form right there. And this form is also attached to, I believe, this recorded webinar. So now I'm going to walk through that form. So if you're filing this complaint on behalf of a particular child, you got to fill out the top that talks about the child's information. So that's going to require you to know the full name of the child, their date of birth, their address, the name of the home district, and name of the home school. That is the resident district and resident school and resident AEA. You need to provide that information. Now, let's say the child is actually living in one school district in AEA, but attending another because they've been placed in another placement, or because they're going to this specialized school, or for some reason or other, they're not attending their home district or their resident district. Then the information of the attending district needs to be provided as well. And there is a line on the form for that. And so you'd have to provide the attending district, the attending school, and the attending AEA if those are different than the resident district. Now, next part of the form, parent or guardian information. That's pretty straightforward on the form. That's going to include full name, address, phone number, email for each parent or guardian that has parental rights. So if, let's say, parents are divorced, both parents retain legal rights to parenting that child, then both of their information should be included on there, unless it's absolutely not attainable because one of the parents is completely AWOL or something of the sort, right? Okay. So once that's filled out, then you get down into the more confusing aspect of this form. And it says, describe the following and use additional sheets of paper if more space is needed. And that's below the title block type place where you're providing parent and child information. So below that, this is when you get into the meat and potatoes of what it is you're complaining about, okay? So nature of the problem, that basically means what's the issue? What's the problem? The next part of it is, what are the facts related to the problem? These are the facts that caused the problem. What are the facts that ended up causing the problem? And then the third part of this piece is proposed resolution to the problem. So what's the solution that you want out of this if you're writing this complaint? What do you want to happen with your child or on behalf of the children in which you're filing this complaint? Okay, so I'm going to go through each of those separately. So, nature of the problem. What is the problem? First, I would use a separate piece of paper because there is not enough room on this form to even write, come close to usually writing what the problem is, okay? If there are multiple problem areas, separate them out using labels like A, B, C in front of each paragraph for what your problem is. In order to identify how to write what the problem is, I would use the Procedural Safeguards Manual for parents that's provided at most IEP team meetings. Oftentimes, it's that big, thick stack of paper that they slide over to you, and they said, hey, do you know about your procedural safeguards? And you say, yes, I've received one of these multiple times. And oftentimes, I think parents, you take it home and you throw it in the recycling bin, as I would do, or the trash. But hopefully you've kept one of those and you use that to identify what it is the school should be doing that you think they are not doing. And that's where you write the problem, right? You say, you know what, school, you should have done this, this, and this according to the Procedural Safeguards Manual, but you did not. That's how you write the problem, okay? And at the end of that entire section there, that's the nature of the problem, I would include a sentence that says the district or AEA has violated the IDEA and has denied the student a free and appropriate public education. You don't absolutely need to do that, but I think it's important to do that. Okay? Now, second part, what are the facts? This is all about just providing facts in an organized manner to show how those problems occurred. And so what I would use is timelines. Those are helpful. Bullet points are helpful. So obviously you're going to need to use a separate piece of paper for this part, and you're going to label it so that we know what it is, right? If I'm reading it, if I'm the Iowa Department of Education, I want to know this is the facts section. And if you've had multiple problems that you've written about in the section above, and you've used A, B, C, D to label those, then use the same labels when you're using facts to talk about each of those problems. Also, at this point, this is where you can include any type of additional information in this facts section that would be helpful for the Iowa Department of Education. That includes copies of IEPs, attendance records, if there's been attendance issues and school avoidance issues, grade reports, if they show that the grades of the child have regressed, have gone down, and it's an area in which they should have an IEP goal, and the goal is not necessarily being, there's no progression on that. You can include emails, correspondence with the school, letters, doctor's notes, those type of things you can include as attachments to this section. And whenever you're talking about facts that have to do with those, you can just say, as seen in the attached IEP dated such and such, or in the attendance records dated such and such, or in the grade report dated such and such. Okay? So that's where you can include that information, and I advise to include that just because it's really helpful to provide to the Iowa Department of Education the information that you're basically basing your claim on, and saying, look, in this IEP, in this graph right here, it shows that in their math goal, they have regressed. They have not gotten better, but they've gotten worse. And this is one of the things that I'm complaining about. You know what I mean? So including that is pretty powerful, and it does a step for the Iowa Department of Education that they don't necessarily have to do, and that is to go dig up the IEP and see if this is indeed true. You've provided them with a copy of that. One thing that I would caution on in this facts part of the case, in the facts part of the complaint, is there's no need to write facts in there that are not relevant to the problem. So what I would do is, once you've got this section written and you have the nature of the problem section written, read it to somebody and see if it makes sense to them, and have that person be listening for facts that don't, you know, necessarily relate to the nature of the problems. Because sometimes, I mean, when you're doing something emotional like this, you want to get it all out there on the paper, and there may be, you know, 3 or 4 paragraphs that may have nothing to do with the issues that you're complaining about, but you're getting them out there because you're upset about them as well. That's not a problem. Just read it to somebody before you actually file it, so that you can pull those pieces out to make sure that it's a clean complaint. So the last part of this, the meat and potatoes of the complaint, is the proposed resolution to the problem. Once again, I'd use a separate piece of paper, have a heading to that says this is the proposed resolutions. I would ask for compensatory education, using that word, compensatory education, for any type of educational gaps that you think might have occurred. I'd ask for training for the school district, for the AEA, anybody involved with violating the IDEA that you're complaining about. I'd ask for any type of reimbursements, as I talked about before, that are directly related to the IDEA violations, such as private school or tutoring, such as I talked about before. Do not ask for money damages, meaning I want money for pain and suffering for my child. That's not allowed for in the IDEA, and you're not going to get it. So don't ask for it. There's no need to. Okay? Don't ask for staff to be fired because of this complaint. You're not going to get that to happen underneath the state complaint. The Iowa Department of Education does not have the jurisdiction to fire people under the IDEA. Also, asking for punishment of teachers or administrators, that's not going to happen, because the Iowa Department of Education does not have jurisdiction in order to do that under the state complaint process. So after you've filled out what the nature of the problem is, facts relating to the problem, and the resolution of the problem, now you get down to the last part of the state complaint form. And there's a sentence here that says, did the alleged violation occur less than 1 year prior to the date that the complaint was received by the Department of Education? You're going to need to mark yes. If the answer is no, then you cannot file this complaint, right? Because as I said before, there is a limitation on how far back you can go with your complaint. Now, the next part of this has to do with the organization or person filing the complaint. You've got to fill out who that person or organization is, their address, city, state, zip code, and the contact name if it's an organization, and a contact method and phone number if that's needed. Okay? And once you've done all that and you've read this through to your friend or family member, and they say, you know what, sounds good, no need for changes or revisions, then you want to put it together in a pile. So you want to put the complaint form on top, then your paper that you wrote about the nature of the problem below that. Then the next part of the complaint has to do with the facts of the case, that paper or papers, put that below that, along with any attachments that were part of that section. That would be IEPs, attendance records, anything else. And then put the proposed resolution to the problem underneath that. And now you have your stack of papers ready, and you're going to either take this to the copying place or have someone you know copy this for you. And you're going to make 4 copies. You're going to send the original of that stack of papers to the Iowa Department of Education, and you're going to address it to them, and it's going to be care of, or to the attention of, the director of the Department of Education, who is Ryan Weiss right now, but you don't even need to write the name on there. You can just write director. Then you're going to send 1 copy to the school district. You're going to send 1 copy to the AEA, and then you're going to keep 1 copy for your files. And that copy for your files should have all the attachments that you included with that. And once you've done that, you should at least be providing with the Iowa Department of Education, if you have a complaint like that filed, you should be providing them with a whole lot of information and a whole lot of relevant information regarding what your complaint is, what the facts are relating to that complaint, and what you want the Department of Education to do about it if they investigate and find that those violations did occur. And now I will open it up for some of the questions that Ask Resources has gathered for me to answer at this time.
Right.
Thank you, Nate. The first question I have is, you discussed earlier the timeline involved in a complaint. I have a question asking about the clarification of that timeline. So, for example, does the 60 calendar days to resolve a complaint mean that the corrective action, any related meetings, trainings, etc., have to be completed within this time frame?
Okay, so there's really 2 parts to this that I'll answer the question. Number 1, the Department of Education has 60 days, calendar days, from the date in which it receives the complaint until that complaint needs to be decided by them. And then during that decision, they're going to write what the corrective action plan is. When that corrective action plan is received by you and the school district and others, then they have up to a year to complete that corrective action plan. So that would include the training and other types of things that the DE, that the Department of Education, is ordering the school district and or AEA to do.
So, to your knowledge, are there any exceptions to that rule for the corrective action?
There is the ability to agree to exceptions to these timelines altogether. So, number 1, parties can agree to an extension to the 60-day timeline for the decision. Also, the Iowa Department of Education can give reason for extending that timeline because it's circumstances that are that they need to be able to investigate more in depth. And so that's kind of a special circumstances extension that the Department of Education can do on their own for that 60 days. Now, that up to a year, that would once again depend on the parties. Parties can agree that this could take longer, And I think the only time that happens or would happen is when, practically speaking, the corrective action plans cannot be completed within a year's time. But for most state complaints, you're not going to agree to a longer timeline than a year for corrective action, because most things are going to be able to be done in a year.
Okay, thank you. So a parent's takeaway from what you just shared should be that they should feel empowered to express their concern about the timeline. If they disagree or have a question, they need to be very clear and make sure that question gets answered. Is that correct?
Absolutely. The IDEA was written to protect who? Parents and their students, not school districts or AEAs. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with school districts or AEAs, but I am saying that's why the law was written, with parents and students in mind. And so, yes, feel empowered when you feel like timelines are too long, even in corrective action plans. You have the ability to ask the state, the Iowa State Department of Education, to be able to shorten those timelines up, particularly for good reason.
Thank you. That's very helpful. The last question we received is also several parts involved. Is the evidence considered in a filed complaint limited to what is provided by the parties involved?
So the Department of Education is allowed to receive information from the parties involved and through their own investigative strategy. So they can visit, like I said before, they can visit school districts, AEAs, request additional records. If they think it's a systemic issue because they've noticed that the child that's been complained about is attending a district that maybe has been complained about before, then they may look into some other things to see whether this is a systemic issue. And they have that ability and that authority under the regulations that are both written under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and under our state regulations as well.
I think you answered the second part of this question. I did have another question pop up. Do you feel filing a state complaint is the vehicle that one should use if you feel your child is been bullied, or would you recommend using another process or procedure available to a parent?
I think if you do not have an attorney available to provide you legal assistance, I think a state complaint is a great way to resolve those type of matters. Not just bullying, but multiple matters that would be issues under the IDEA. And I think that it is a process that works in our state right now because of the people involved at the Iowa Department of Education right now take state complaints very seriously and work hard in order to make sure that school districts and AEAs are complying with the law. When you look at other states across the United States, their state complaint process does not work as well as Iowa's, and I wouldn't recommend, if you're in those other states, using that. But here in Iowa, it actually is a process that works. So if you don't have an attorney and you don't want to go through the due process then I think state complaints really do work and really do end up resolving such issues, and sometimes can bring up systemic issues to the Iowa Department of Education that you may not have had in your mind because you were focused on your student, but they've seen enough to see that, hey, this isn't a systemic issue that maybe ends up resolving things for multiple other students beyond just your child, which is a good thing, I think.
Well, that wraps up the questions that we had pre-submitted for this webinar. So we will be ending today's webinar. Again, thank you, Nathan, for presenting this information for our families and professionals that support those families. And we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.